All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is episode 14 of the Healthcare Growth Cycle podcast. And today we've got an awesome guest on in the healthcare health tech space, David Kuraguntla, CEO and founder of Alio.ai. David's doing some really cool things in the remote patient monitoring space, wearables, and I'd really like to dive into, David, your story on actually founding this health tech company and the journey that it's brought, the leadership aspects, and just really excited to have you on.
Awesome. It's a pleasure to be here, Christian. Thanks again for the invite and excited to dig into the conversation.
Yeah, so if you just want to start by giving a little background, a little bit more of an introduction into who you are and how you got to founding Alio, I think that'd be really helpful for the listeners.
For sure. I think I had an opportunity to be excited about the patient problem by heading into medical school after a few years of research at NIH. And it was neat, right? I think I was very immersed, obviously, in the medical space, but I always knew that I was very interested in the trinkets, if you will. Thought I was heading off, had matched actually into a surgical residency and thought I was heading in that direction. But always found myself very intrigued talking to folks in the ER that had different tools, whether it was a scrub tech working on a new tool or a sales rep that was in with something interesting, really found myself pulled towards that. Along that same time, one of my good childhood friends was involved in an early stage startup as well. That was a tech spinout. So I got a chance to really talk a little bit more about the clinical aspect and get a courtside seat, if you will, to entrepreneurship, which was pretty neat. He and his co-founder ended up having that company get acquired in the wound care space. And right about then, I had actually started to get confronted by the patient problem that Alio is now tackling and just seeing it very directly. I thought I was headed off into the vascular space, and it was right there. And for me, it was solving a little bit of an interesting problem, if you will, of we're doing these procedures on patients, they're walking out the door, they're coming back in days, weeks, months later, and you just feel unsatisfied, right? And if you will, bottom of the totem pole as a medical student was, how do you call up your resident and say, hey, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, this patient's back in, there seems to be a problem, and no one's happy because you're doing a life-altering procedure that might not be great, right? Instead of the life-saving one that you probably had just performed a few weeks ago. So the question became, how do you solve a sampling error problem? Is with data and software, and that was kind of the fundamental realization, teamed up with the co-founders that I mentioned, and that was the beginning of the Alio journey. So instead of starting with the tech, we were able to actually start off with the patient problem this time, and something I think is fundamentally important to what we at Alio like to call the 4 Ps of the patient, physician, provider, and payer, that you have to align the interests of all four. Otherwise, I think it's a lot tougher to make it in the marketplace.
Wow, yeah, no, that's huge. So I guess walk me through the actual product that is Alio. Like, how did you go about founding that, as far as, or creating that rather? I'd just be curious to learn more about all of the development and product design that went into it.
For sure. So, funnily enough, we actually started off on the implantable side. We thought we were going to make stent 3.0. So, once again, given my kind of penchant towards vascular, et cetera,
Sure.
we thought, okay, if stent 1.0 was a bare metal stent, stent 2.0 was a drug eluting stent 3.0 was going to be the smart stent, where you could basically drop a sensor onto a stent and it's going to tell your doctor that you're about to lose a leg, have a heart attack, potentially have another stroke. That was the idea, right? And so we actually got that through a benchtop testing, animal testing, with the proceeds of my co-founder's previous exit. So that was great. A lot of sweat equity and a lot of founder capital went into that procedure. And from that perspective, we realized that we were not going to make the world's best stent, right? We were going to have to partner. We went to the names that you know and love, started to get some term sheets from, being able to license different aspects of the technology. So that was where we were at. And at that point, we started to realize that market dynamics, time dollars, sales dynamics were just very different, right? In terms of the stakeholder alignment wasn't there to what we needed, and I think that
Okay.
became a little bit of a question for us to solve. And we went back actually to those four Ps and said, okay, what do we want to do? And one of the key features that had really uh, come up to us was a patient population that's near and dear to my heart in the dialysis space. Of I'd gotten invited by one of my good mentors and one of our board observers, Terry Litchfield. She'd been involved in creating a network of vascular access centers that was eventually acquired by DaVita and became was Lifeline Vascular Access. And she said, Dave, I know that you've wanted to maybe put this into these patients to be able to monitor them. There's a very high access failure rate. Is there a way to keep this journey going? Because you can't leave these patients behind. And so that became, all right, we've got about 2.5, I think we had 2.5 months of cash in the bank at that point. We said, all right, is there a different way of doing this? And one of our engineers who had worked on the Google Smart Contact Lens when they were trying to do the diabetes monitoring said, what happens if we try and do this outside of the body? So that's where the pivot to the wearable was made. And that was really when we kind of almost had to restart that journey of discovery. But I think we went back to our fundamentals of how do we really align everybody? Is there strong stakeholder alignment across those four Ps? So I'll pause there and then I can dive into the exact product here if you've got a question on that part of the story.
Yeah, I guess just to take it because I'm not a medical expert by any means. I'm in healthcare data, but I don't know the ins and outs of the human body. Does this wearable monitor patients on dialysis, or like what's the background as far as the medical conditions that this wearable assists with and helps treat?
Yeah, for sure. So that I'll say the end stage kidney patient is the initial wedge,
Okay,
but it is going further upstream into chronic kidney disease, cardiorenal, and it is approved. Some aspects of it are approved for the general patient population. To hope to bring all the aspects that I'm sure we'll talk about to any patient population. So we're seeing interest across oncology, post ICU monitoring to cardiorenal, as I mentioned. That cardiac and renal piece is obviously a very large
okay,
market that has some wearable exposure, but I think not the differentiated exposure. And
sure,
maybe, just from your perspective on data, the comment that I would make is part of the reason why we made that pivot from the implantable to the wearable wasn't about the technical feasibility of the hardware. It was all about the how do you monetize the sale of the data, right? And
sure,
if the data is going to be about your stent is failing and you need a new one, there was a large question of, well, how does that get either reimbursed? Who pays for it? Insurance companies likely to pay for it because you're doing maybe an easier procedure electively earlier than a bad procedure, if you will, later on. And so that was a big, actually, the healthcare data component and the efforts of getting that into a population was actually a much harder process than anything actually on the hardware side, funnily enough,
sure.
that you might think about. So.
Okay. And as far as monitoring, do these patients typically have just one medical condition, or could it be a variety of different medical conditions? I guess yeah, just like what exactly is it monitoring?
Yeah, once again, looking at it from the data perspective, right? What drives the needle? So access was where we started. We realized that we could place what effectively looks like a little band-aid on the arm of these patients over top of their dialysis access. We could monitor
Okay,
it for whether or not it was going to fail, right? Completely non-invasively, no needles or anything else, nothing for them to set up. If you can literally put a band-aid on your arm and plug in a little hub to transmit that data, everything's up and running.
yeah,
But once again, the healthcare data component was really important here because just the access failure, once again, the alignment at the provider physician payer angle was very disparate. You had vascular access centers that had some interests, you had dialysis centers that had a different set of interests, different physicians and nephrologists versus the vascular surgeon or interventionalists were all of once again there was an alignment. So we took a step back and we said, classic Pareto principle, what really drives the needle here, right? And so it became there's three big things that cause 80% of the hospitalizations for that end stage kidney disease patient. And it was the access failure, effectively
Yeah.
fluid overload or whether or not um, their potassium is too high or too low. So that can
Okay.
they cause a morbidity mortality as well. So then we took a step back and said, all right, how do we actually acquire that data? Realized we needed to build a wearable that didn't just have a sensor for access failure, added in about another 10 sensors. So now there's about a dozen sensors across the thermal, mechanical, optical, and acoustic space that are looking for not just your access failure, not just your basic vitals like heart rate, temperature, SpO2, but have pushed past that into getting things like hemoglobin hematocrit. So that helps us develop for anemia, which is important.
Okay.
Patients are typically on EPO. It's very expensive. So once again, that kind of drives into stakeholder alignment. Then you're also we utilize that to convert that into a fluid status component. So we can actually say this patient is fluid overloaded or not. We can give that to the patient, and that, not just the patient, sorry, but to their clinical team. And that way that is a big
Yeah.
source of hospitalization for the patient. And then we also became the world's first company to be able to leverage that data that we got and put that into a potassium algorithm that was actually cleared by the FDA as well. So became the world's first to do that. And so now you're covering what drives 80% of the hospitalizations for these patients, right? And so I think that started to become um, more useful. And then that's when that data can actually, I know we've talked about monetization of that data a few
Yeah.
times, and not to sound too overly focused on that, but it is better patient outcomes,
Yeah.
lower payer cost means you do have a monetization pathway that is not reliant on, um, I'll say, low reimbursement that exists for RPM today.
Okay. Got it. And is access considered like a low reimbursement remote patient monitoring procedure, or is that
So actually, the role kind of flipped. So what was very
okay?
interesting is we saw RPM. There are a lot of the basics: heart rate, temperature, SpO2. Okay, coming once
Sure.
again from a clinical background, it was all right. You can help prevent decompensation in that hospital monitoring, that post ICU. We saw a lot of that the I'll say the EKG world. That I kind of the Holter monitor replacement world that iRhythm obviously blazed a trail on was getting very crowded with follow-ons. So we said, okay, how do you create a more useful product for the patient and physician? But then how do you also get the provider and payer to have some strong alignment in terms of reimbursement? And I think as we've seen over the last decade, that reimbursement has gone down. You
Yeah.
have to get a lot of, I'll say, inertia to get the clinical buy-in of why do I want this data? Who's paying attention to it? Why do I have to trawl through all the data? Can somebody actually alert me? So that was something we focused on is there an arena where the world is going to shift? And that happened in kidney care. So historically, all end-stage kidney disease patients they get dumped into effectively Medicare. So effectively single payer. There's a small time period where it's overlaps with a private payer. But despite being about 1% of the Medicare population, it was pushing to almost 10% of the overall Medicare budget. So
Okay.
outsized utilization of resources, if you will. So a few years ago, there was a series of legislation that came into place that actually created incentivization to do
Hmm.
value-based care. So now we're seeing that
Okay.
market shift from sub 10% to over 50%. And I think on its way to somewhere between two-thirds and three-quarters of the market being in a value-based care. So now that
Wow.
risk has been shifted onto payers, providers, some, payer provider hybrids, et cetera, and into that marketplace where now that hospital avoidance is actually very, very valuable. Some
Yeah.
of these patients are going to get hospitalized and visit the ICU 2 or 3 times a year. Average for that stay is, $20,000 or more. So now you're running into, can I drop that down if I can just intervene earlier, via telehealth or a nurse visit or something that is just a lot lower acuity than obviously an ICU stay.
Okay. Got it. Let's talk about the leadership aspect and founding the company. What does your team look like? Like, how did they go? How did you go about assembling your company team?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly different stages in terms of the company. There's that 0 to 1 stage, I'll say that 1 to 10 stage in many ways is pretty messy, and then trying to figure out what your, commercial phase company and iterative phase of the company
Sure.
looked like. And that was, from 0 to 1, we had to find a very interesting blend of engineers, I'll say, right? We've always been very engineering heavy. We obviously had hardware, we had data transmission, we had, um clinician-facing UI that
Yeah.
you had to utilize as well. You had obviously had an entire optical sensing platform. We were doing things that nobody had done before in that effort. So data science as well on the machine learning AI side before that really existed,
Yeah.
if you will, almost 7 8 years ago before the craze that it is now. And we were doing hard technical work, right? Then as you got through that initial phase, you start to layer on the regulatory and commercial, regulatory and clinical aspect, your quality aspect, that comes into place as you're heading towards that next phase. And I do think you need to start bringing on some of the commercial effort, right? So I think all of your
Sure.
sales, I think should be founder led at that early stage. I think that's how you get that feedback. We probably wouldn't have made the big bet of going after hemoglobin hematocrit and potassium if we didn't have that feedback from the clinician. I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
and from the providers and payers as well. So all parts of the stack, I think, was important to get. Otherwise, I think we would have entered the market with just an access, and it would have been great. Are you giving
Yeah.
this to me for free? I'll use it. But then how do we actually get there? And so that was important to get. And I think so getting some of that commercial input, getting someone to help you, whether it's at the enterprise level or the clinician level, whatever the sales team looks like. I don't think you can do that too early. I think there is some risk in putting the cart before the horse, but at the
Yeah.
same time, making sure you have someone that's willing to get not just sell but listen. I think is actually important in that early stage, and then fundamentally get into the I'll say the clearance aspect. You're starting to get more into that 1 to 10. I think sometimes there's going to be a transition, right? Of kind of the what got you here won't get you there, and I think
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a change of the team at that point. And we made some decisions of going after clearances across the FDA, CE mark, and Saudi FDA, which we received. And then there's a transition, I'd say, which we're going through right now and back into that commercial phase of iteration on the engineering side, stabilization on the quality manufacturing side, and then, more of deployment, customer service, and how do you make sure you delight people with what you have.
Yeah, and how did you go about getting capital? Was it through venture, like seed, pre-seed? Like, did you go through any rounds on the VC front? Just curious.
So we raised about $66 million to date so far. I will say very much our first seed round was very much a friends and family
Nice.
of passing a hat around at a birthday party sort of situation. And a lot of those folks stuck with us. They were always, I think the first three folks that wrote a check were always the first three folks into every round I think that we ever did, which was great. I think the second check that was ever put into us actually became was a an engineer out at Facebook and actually understood I think some of the challenges of the cloud and data side that we were going to face, and is our largest investor and has been a really good stalwart for us. But I will say we did not go the traditional venture route, right? So there's about four family offices that probably are about 15-20% each of the total financing, I should say, and then the rest are some clinicians, folks that have been through the wars before.
Yeah.
And so, I'll say 99% of the cap table has been very supportive and pushed us forward, which has been great and helped us do that discovery process. But it was it was not driven by the venture side. I think there was once again 10 years, as we've done that over the last 10 years,
Yeah.
there's a strong bifurcation of device and data,
Yeah. Yeah.
and trying to talk about enterprise SaaS sales into the device side and talking about needing FDA for an unproven, uh, potentially not 510K, even though we were able to do our
Yeah.
potassium process as a 510K, there was a lot of concern it was going to be a PMA, much more complex process. And so I think it wasn't easy, right? I mean, that was a level of risk that people weren't willing to take, but we were able to find some aligned folks that saw what the world could like,
Yeah.
that wasn't a wearable, consumer wearable or an ICU with wires, and how do you actually make that take a bet on that future. And when we were lucky enough to have some folks, make that bet and make that commitment, which has been great.
Yeah, and did you have to go through clinical trials for this wearable
We
or
did. We did.
okay,
So there
okay.
was definitely it wasn't just here's a predicate, we're the same
That's good.
510(k) filing. You definitely had to do a lot of
Yeah.
data. I think over time, I think 2,000 plus patients, and obviously multiple data samples over multiple time points, sequentially or intermittently across their lives, trying to get people where they're at. We also, being an optical sensor, we realized that skin tone, for example, can make a big difference. I think during COVID, there was obviously, darker skin tones and SpO2 was a question. Since we do everything at a cloud processing level, it allowed us to actually calibrate for skin tone every time we take a reading in ambient light,
Wow.
which improves our accuracy. So it's actually a accuracy driven component more than
Mhm.
anything else, but that also meant you had to go to different places, right? So we did stuff domestically here in the U.S. from Arkansas to Alaska, and then even
Wow.
across in both the UK and then also in Jordan as well. So I think there was different places that we were able to do clinical trials to get some of that different
Yeah.
regional feedback, customer
So is it
feedback, which is important.
yeah, is the process typically so you get funding or capital, right? Like some of those family rounds and whatnot, and then after that you build the product and then how do you even like get into clinical trials for that? Like do you have to pitch the product um to a board? I don't know if it's like a healthcare administration board. I would just like to understand the process a little bit more
Yeah,
there.
for sure. So I think something that we're very proud of is we've been under budget every year of our existence as a startup. That being said, you're jumping off the cliff and you've heard the analogy of jumping off a cliff and building a parachute on the way down,
Yeah.
right? And it's certainly that aspect. So you are working on all of those fronts, right? You are trying to get the regulatory feedback of what will a clinical study. You're working backwards, and that's something that certainly try to espouse the team is working backwards from the goal. So if we want to get this cleared, what does a final clinical trial look like? The pivotal, if you will. What does your pre-pivotal look like? And then, what was really a big black box for us was, okay, if the FDA wants 200 patients at this level of accuracy,
Yeah.
now you have a bunch of algorithmic effort, right? And you don't know if that's 10 patients and you have an algorithm, right? You don't know if that's 100 patients and you have an algorithm, or that's going to be 10,000 patients. Complicating that was if you're going to go after something like potassium, you can't just get people that are normal, right? You just get a bunch of
Sure.
people that are in the normal range. You can't go to the FDA and say, I want to get highs and lows, and I'm going to be able to tell you what's wrong. I'm going to be able to give an alert to a clinician that the patient's outside of the bounds of normal if all the data is normal. So then you have to start being creative of how do I get these data points? And so that then goes into finding really good partners to your question of you got to pitch clinicians, right? So you're then in that point, you're
Okay.
pitching clinicians. We had to find, it wasn't easy, right? There was a lot of folks that were like, well, I get a lab draw once a month. Do I need this? Will I have more liability if I get this data? What will my clinical workflow be? So you got to find those key champions, those
Yeah.
folks that are do or die, that are going to ride with you. We actually found a couple of those. Interestingly enough, it's how we ended up in the UK was being with the NHS. The docs that were involved, they understood that entire, once again, that payment life cycle. So here in the US, it's obviously very disparate. At that time, before the VBC legislation came into place, we saw a lot more uptake once that came into place. The clinicians were catching on what's in it for them, and the providers were as well. But we went actually to the NHS. We found some really great partners there that were able to start getting us the data, do the iterative cycles, and that were just willing to go. You have to find someone's willing to go on that journey with you, right? You come in to
Yeah.
their clinic, you put it on, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 patients, for a few days,
Yeah.
come back stateside, process the data for a couple of months, say, hey, I think we did this. So you have to find a really good partner that wants to go along long road with you.
Wow. Yeah. Well, what did it feel like landing your first customer after all of that?
It was neat. I think there was a really exciting opportunity to
Yeah.
just hear their story, mesh with our story, right? Just listening to what problems were they solving. And it was, hey, this will help solve the problem. We've tried, these different ways to tackle the issue. Is there a way to help us? And that was neat to see. So it was
Yeah.
very much a mutual journey. So they had actually been involved in some of our clinical work with
Okay.
us as well. They were the ones, I'd say in many ways, they are bigger champions of what this could be than we were. I think in many
Wow.
ways it was like, all right, I get that we could put it on all patients, but maybe we got to kind of start here first. And I think it's exciting. But, at the same time, you're trying to balance those pieces as a CEO is certainly interesting.
Yeah, for sure. What's like one of the biggest surprises in your journey founding a health tech startup?
I think in many ways, so many of I'd say at the CEO level, so many of the fights that you will take on have nothing to do with the product, have nothing to do with the FDA, that regulatory step. And quite frankly, you could probably even figure out the commercialization step. It's
Sure.
everything else, right? It's actually the company building, the people management, the shareholder, stakeholder management component of of everything that's happening. I think that's
Yeah.
actually in many ways, particularly when you're trying to define a category or build a new category, you're gonna have as I think in many ways you're gonna have as many haters as you probably more haters than you'll have proponents, and that's tough. But I think you got to be able to just keep your head down on what you know is right. That means sometimes you're gonna take a lot of flack for it, and that's okay. It might not be
Yeah.
as fun, or you're not going to have as many exciting PR announcements maybe as some of the other folks out there, and you just have to be okay
Sure.
with it. And I think stick to your guns on what do we want to do, what did we set out to do, what was the mission, and are we doing the right thing for patients,
Love
and
that.
will that should translate then into we've made sure that there's alignment on the commercial side. So we're doing the right thing for patients, we're doing the right thing for our shareholders, and we're doing the right thing for our employees. And then timing has to be right, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you get knocked back 10 steps, and that's okay. You just gotta endure. And I think keep moving forward despite however hard it may seem.
It's awesome. What would you say is one of the most enjoyable aspects on the flip side? Is it seeing the patient alignment and like if you're for me, I feel like for me it'd be if I were to land my first customer after all of that hardship going through clinical trials and then seeing a real problem being solved. That would probably be the capstone for me, but I was just curious to kind of get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think in I'd say there's three, and I'd say funnily enough, getting that first contract was I'd say was number two of the three. But patience, I would say bookend either side of that. So I'd say number one was actually our first clinical trial. We had just made the pivot to the wearable. We went to enroll a patient. I was with our head of clinical, and she was looking to enroll the patient, and was asking, she had asked if they could be involved, and it was a husband and wife, and they were a little nervous, and it was actually at that moment we realized we needed to remind people there's no needles on the patch, and so actually they went in, they had their procedure, they came back out, they're in the recovery room, and was just talking to them, and the wife was like, "Hey, I'm sorry, it was pre-procedure. I wasn't hearing everything. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're hoping to do with this product?" And this was a gentleman that had had multiple vascular accesses created, and he was back in to have another one had failed, shut down. They're creating a new one. So there's only so many places on your arms, and then they kind of start going to your
Sure.
legs and weird places. So, he's kind of running out. And I still remember we talked about it. He was a little groggy. She was hearing it. And I was walking out of the room, and she, I think it was like he had just had a procedure on his right arm. Unfortunately, had run out of space on his left. And she patted his left arm. She said, "Man, I wish this technology had existed before because we could have saved your other arm." And I think that was that
Wow.
moment of like, all right, this journey's worth it, right? And so I think that leads then to
Yeah.
that contract component. And then I'd say number three, real quick, was just the first time, one of your customers calls you back and says, "Hey, we kept somebody out of the hospital,"
Wow.
right? Your alert came in. we did this. This was our clinical pathway to solve it. And I think that was like, wow, this is that culmination of that journey that gets you through
Yeah.
all those tough moments. Is all
Dang.
those little milestones are certainly important. And I think, the next one is, how many people can you help? And I hope that we can keep getting to some of those milestones along the way.
I love it, David. Thanks for sharing all that. I'll just give you, so we're at about time here, so I'll just give you the floor. Like, if you want to plug where people can find you, if they want to reach out to you, or where people can learn a little bit more about Alio, that would be, yeah, really
Yeah, for
awesome.
sure. So we're continuing to get some great inbound, looking to help more customers. But feel free to reach out to me at Dave, Dave, at Alio.ai, and happy to answer any questions and happy to discuss how we might be able to help monitor your patients, keep them out of the hospital, and help move folks forward and let them get back to living their best lives with their families and helping everyone out in that entire chain. So thanks again, Christian. I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, likewise, David. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, this is episode 14 of the Healthcare Growth Cycle podcast. We will see you for the next episode. Thank you.